Welcome to our workshop today on Drone Data 101. It's really great to see you all. As you know, this is part of Love Data Week. So this is Love Data Week. And if you haven't checked out the full schedule of Love Data Week workshops, please, I would recommend it because there's a lot going on and we're happy to be part of this. So myself and my colleague, Sean Hogan, are going to talk a little bit today about Drone Data 101 and getting started with that. All right. So, Sean and myself are part of the University of California system that a lot of people have never heard of. When you think of UC, you think of the campuses, you think of the labs, but there's this whole other branch, and we are part of the Ag and Natural Resources Division, and our part of the UC system is mostly off campuses. So we have researchers scattered throughout the entire state. They're doing applied research around agriculture, around natural resources. We have clusters of faculty who are on campuses, on 5 of the campuses right now. We have a bunch of these statewide programs that are working with youth development and nutrition and policy. You may have heard of some of them. So 4-H is really popular. It's a public-facing youth education program. Master Gardeners is another one. If you're interested in any of this, please let us know. We like telling people about it. It's a great career pathway. If you're into applied research, working with ag and natural resources, we have field stations. So please check us out. You want to say hi real quick, Sean, before we keep going?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, welcome. This is going to be fun. I'm Sean Hogan, located in Davis. I'm the coordinator for the UCANR drone program, and as we'll talk about shortly, have a fair bit of experience in this way.
Yeah, and I'm actually also on the Berkeley campus, as I see many of you are, so that's great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we want to cover like in the next 45 minutes or so. Our goal in this intro is to really give you kind of a high-level roadmap of using drones specifically for mapping and data collections. So drones are being used for all kinds of interesting things these days, for carrying things, for spraying. But we're specifically talking here about using drones for their ability to take images and then use those for mapping and research. So I will begin with an intro section where we'll talk a little bit about what equipment you might need to do this kind of thing. What is so special about drone imagery anyway, if you may have heard about it? How does photogrammetry work? Because that's really what has really explored or expanded what you can do with drone data. And then a little bit about how you can get started. And then I'm going to turn over to Sean, where he'll go through some case studies of where we've used drones in research. All right. So a lot of times people will come to us and say, what kind of drone do I need? But we always like to step back there and ask them to think first about what kind of sensor, what kind of data do you need? Because the drone, it's really just a platform to to fly around and take pictures in the sense that we're talking here. So there's a bunch of sensors out there. Sometimes you don't have a choice. It might be a small drone and all you get is a RGB camera, not unsimilar from what you might have in your phone, but generally good quality. Bigger drones, you can attach your own sensors. You can buy special sensors, multi-spectral, thermal, hyperspectral. Don't have time to get into all the details, but think first about what kind of data you want to collect for your purpose. And then you can start thinking about, well, what kind of drone has that kind of sensor? And in general, there's 2 big categories of them. Multi-rotor drones is probably what you would start out with. That's certainly what we recommend. For the small ones, they get bigger and bigger. The bigger ones, they're more like erector sets. You can attach different kinds of cameras to them. They typically will have 4 or 6 propellers, depending how much weight they cover. They're super easy to use, fun to use. The small ones are very easy to fly. If you have a larger study area, you might look at a fixed wing. And so that, they can cover a longer distance, a longer battery life. And then in the last few years, the VTOLs have really matured. So there's a few models of vertical takeoff and landing drones that also might be worth looking at. So what you get will depend on what kind of data you need, what kind of sensor, your budget, how big of an area you're trying to study, and then also your experience. Because I wouldn't recommend a new person like to start off with a, like a difficult to fly drone. In terms of the images, the imagery data that you can get from drones, there are some, we're going to talk about photogrammetry, but I do want to mention that just taking individual images like photo points can be really useful. So just repeating, you fly the drone to the same place, maybe every season, every year, every week, and take a photo at the same location. Those are called photo points. And that by itself can be useful. And it's often done by, for environmental monitoring kind of stuff. Drone 360s are another kind of data product that you can take with drone images. You fly the drone up, it takes a series of photos, 20, 25 photos in a circle, and then you stitch them together, and you get a beautiful interactive 360 photo. I will share a link in the chat window to this slide deck so you can click on this example one. I don't want to go there right now. Another kind of video data product, image product that you can get from drones is video. And most of these drones, certainly the prosumer ones, are designed for videography primarily. So they have good qualities. And with some special software, you can actually make that video georeferenced. And that can also be useful in some use cases where you have to kind of like visually scan what's on the ground for a fairly large area. Right? It's relatively easy to do if you have all the software together. But we're talking about today, is photogrammetry, because this is really where you get the magic happens. So when you use drones to take a series of images in a grid pattern like you see here, then you can feed that into a photogrammetry platform and get different kinds of data products out there. And this is the bread and butter of what we and a lot of people who are using drones for research are doing. And I'm going to talk about the different products that you get out of this. But this is really where the cool stuff happens. I'll talk a little bit more about photogrammetry in a second. But let me also talk about multi-spectral data, because the cameras that you can put on a drone don't just have to be your basic RGB cameras. There are several cameras, sensors, that are multi-spectral. And that basically means they can record reflectance in parts of the visible spectrum that our eyes can't see. Right? So the sun is super bright, it's putting out all the wavelengths. Those wavelengths bounce off objects. And if you're interested in vegetation, multispectral data, specifically the infrared and the near infrared parts of the spectrum, these are really, really helpful because healthy and unhealthy vegetation, they really pop out in those bands. Our eyes can't see them, but the sensors on the drones can pick that out. And when you fuse that together with the green and the red band, it's really, really helpful for vegetation work. And this is really mature technology. This started decades ago with satellite images. So that's kind of our bread and butter is that. So where's the sweet spot for drone data? One of our messages is that drone data is not a panacea for everything, but if you do need that really fine spatial scale, like really small objects that you can detect, if you need to fly it frequently or on demand, if your area isn't ginormous, then drones could very well be worth looking at for your kind of work. And if you're working with structural data, that's another one. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about photogrammetry. So how does this work? Well, this is not new. Ever since they've been, people have been up in balloons, they realized if you can see something on the ground, a pebble, a shadow, a house, if you can see it from two locations and you know where those locations are, then you can figure out where that object is in 3D space. That's the essence of it. It's a lot of geometry. This is really matured. All of the topo maps for decades and decades were built using this kind of analysis. Modern photogrammetry has taken that to the next level. In modern photogrammetry, which is what we're doing with drones, everything on the ground, that leaf, the tip of that shadow, that little pebble, you can see it from many, many more locations, as in not like in the dozens, right? So that's quite common. You fly the drone, so everything you see, you can see it from multiple angles. You know where the drone was when it took that photo. And then the software uses automated techniques to basically find all of those little identifiable spots on the ground, give each one the equivalent of a barcode. And if it sees that same object in multiple images, it stitches them together, right? That by itself would give you a great product, but in addition, the new software is also correcting for other kinds of distortions, lens distortion, relief distortion, and so on. So what you get out of this is a very, very high, spatially accurate data, images, and three-dimensional data out of the box. If you're just doing the basic, you're following the right guidelines, and you get good data, you get really some amazing results. The caveat, though, this does take large amounts of computing. It's a lot of data, as we'll see. So you can't do this on your intro-level laptop. So how do you get started working with this? The first thing is you got to fly the drone in such a way that it's going to do a very consistent pattern and take images at those regular intervals. The good news is that you don't have to be a super skilled drone pilot to do this. There's apps that you can use to create your flight plan and tell it, how high to fly the drone, how closely to put the images together, and then it'll do the work for you. Now, that being said, though, this means not all drones are compatible with this kind of flight planning app. So some of the cheaper drones don't support waypoint missions, and therefore they're not really suitable for this kind of thing. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You're also going to need software. And you can't do this in Excel, you can't do it in R. There are some choices out there. This slide is probably not completely up to date, but you do need special software. I'll just leave it at there to do that photogrammetry, because it really is quite specialized. And what the software is going to do, it's going to look at each and every single image. It's going to find those key points, and when it sees them in multiple images, it's going to use those to tie those images together. It knows where the drone was, it knows where the angle was, and it's going to do all those corrections. And what you're going to get out of that will be a point cloud. So literally, it's just points in space, X, Y, Z. But those points also have images to them, right? So they're like little teeny pieces of photographs of the photos that have been stitched out. But this point cloud by itself, it's super dense, and it's really good for visualization, and you can use it for some kinds of analysis. You also get out of the software a digital surface model. So this is a raster. It's a two-dimensional surface where it basically everything from above, the pixel values tell you what is the elevation of that feature. The digital terrain model is similar, but with the digital terrain model, the software has artificially identified what's ground level and what's on top of the ground, like a tree is on, and then the trees and the buildings, they're like virtually erased, and what it gives you back is just an estimate of what the bare ground looks like, right? So these two-dimensional products are standard, and then you also get the orthomosaic, right? So the orthomosaic is that super high resolution, spatially accurate, top-down image. Basically, it takes that surface model and it drapes over the images, does some blending. And again, it doesn't just make it spatially accurately, but it corrects for distortions and a lot of other things. So this is one of the main products that researchers will use to then feed into the rest of the analysis, right? Which we're not talking about, or I'm not talking about here, but Sean will talk about what you do with these products for research. And a little caveat about doing this processing is that you're going to start getting really large data, right? So the images themselves might just be a couple hundred gigabytes, but once you start typing that in through the software, it blows up really quick. So that's something to be aware of. So how do you get going with this? Let's talk, first of all, safety and regulations are really important. This is where an ounce of prevention can really save you a lot of pain and maybe a lot of money. We don't have time to go into detail, but all I can say is this is multi-layered. So just be aware that there's different organizations, they have different jurisdictions, they have different things that they worry about. The FAA is definitely the big gorilla in the room. They have jurisdiction from everything from the blade of grass on up. The good news, though, is that their rules are fairly well spelled out, and they're uniform. So, but just be aware that there's rules that even as a student or as a researcher that you need to be aware of. There are some special circumstances for academics, though, so that's worth knowing. And there are also some other good news is that within the UC system, there's a fair bit of resources that can help you get started and help you get better. So start out with your campus. Every campus has a safety coordinator. And they're not just about safety and getting your flight plan approved. They're really helpful resources. They can put you in touch with other people who are using drones on your campus. Many of the campuses have clubs that might be more focused on building drones or racing drones, but check those out as well. Many campuses have classes that might be focused on engineering or remote sensing, but that's another place. And a good tip we often suggest for people who are like trying to get experience is grad students are always looking for help, right? So if you're interested in using drones for something like that, put yourself out there and volunteer. You can learn a lot that way. Also, we are really lucky in the UC system that we have a phenomenal center which helps all of the campuses, the Unmanned Aircraft System Safety Office, and I'll put these links in the chat window here in a bit, but they are a great resource for your campus contacts. There is a insurance policy that you would be covered under if you're using drones. And then they have a really good knowledge portal as well, like how to fly at night and take care of your batteries and the policies. And it's a really, really great portal of knowledge. And then finally, a shout out to Drone Camp. This is a collaborative week-long training that we are part of, IGIS. In fact, we started it, but right now it's collaborative. Like there's multiple universities, there's multiple instructors come from different places. I think we're like in our 8th year, perhaps, so it's fairly mature. And it covers the whole thing, everything you need to know from getting started, equipment, safety, regulations, including data processing, because there's not many camps out there that will teach you that, right? So check that out. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sean to wow you with some research stories.
All right. Yes. By the way, I was looking at the chat, and if you have questions, you can throw them in there. But it looks like we're going to have plenty of time to answer questions at the end too. So if you have something that you would like to ask about, we'll have time for that here shortly. So it's funny, before we came to this presentation, Andy and I were talking about what we might present, and I was thinking, love Data Week. And I was going to regale you with wildly overly complex data management stuff that is something that you'll learn down the road. We do a number of presentations and workshops and a small almost conference on drone applications. And one of the things that you'll come away with from those kinds of things is it is complex. You can take little steps to get there. A lot of the skills that you learn from one, or that you could apply to one thing, will transfer to the next thing. And what I'm referring to is, say, agriculture to natural resources, same techniques, different results, similar analyses in a lot of ways. And fortunately, in our program, we've had a chance to explore all of these different kind of research domains, whether it be rangeland ecology, habitat restoration, post-fire monitoring, forest recovery, a lot of crop mapping for various purposes that I'll jump into here shortly, and precision agriculture, water stress, vineyards, you name it. So we have all of these different areas that we've studied, and and when we give presentations, we try to convey what we wish we knew when we first started, and that we've learned kind of I would say the hard way, sometimes the fun way, but it is a challenge occasionally. And so, yeah, yes, have questions if you have any. Next slide. So again, we've done quite a few campaigns, and what I want to talk about today is case studies, because it's fun. I'll have a lot of pictures and pretty pictures to show you here, but yeah, I just did a recount. Oh, this has not updated. Oh, because I just made the change since Andy started the presentation. I looked at our data sheet. We've actually flown. Oh, there you'll go. I updated the numbers just on this slide. There's not very many. There's the only one. I looked at the numbers right beforehand, and I was like, oh, that number's really old. We've actually flown 84 missions, not 48 missions. And instead of, I forget what it was, about 34 square kilometers. We've done more like 96, which is 23,500 acres almost that we've covered in missions now. Some of those missions have grown as we've gone on, being that we have fire research that we do at Hopland Center, where we cover like 3,000 acres, kind of a campaign. So that gets to be a lot. But these projects, they cover all things agriculture and natural resources, and looking at improving productivity in a lot of cases. They cover forest areas, rangelands, grasslands, wetlands, and these are great tools at the right scale. As you can imagine, in like the university academy, a lot of what we look at is case study scale plots, and something under a couple thousand or so acres is very doable with a drone. When you're looking at something in a larger area, then you're maybe considering something like a occupied flight over, or a satellite imagery, which is also out there. Next slide. So what we did is, at one point of those 84 campaigns, we took 3 of those campaigns and just did a little basic analysis for logistical kind of planning of how long it takes for each segment or part of a project. And everyone always thinks about the flights, but there's all these other areas. Next slide, because it'll pop up, that are just as important and really take a lot more time. So what I'm referring to, so we have mission planning and product coordination can be forgotten about. I just spent this morning doing that for another project myself. Preparing gear, that takes time, and configuring that gear, loading and unloading, that seems like a trivial thing, but just getting your gear all cleaned off, reconfigured, mounted sensors, you name it, that takes quite a bit of time. Drive time to your project site, GCP placement, and what I'm referring to there is ground control targets that you can put on the ground and record with a high precision GPS. And then you lock your imagery to those points when you do your processing. And that's valuable for both change detection between dates, as well as tying the imagery to ancillary data, like some other field measurements that need to be precise to match up to the imagery that you're going to be analyzing. And all of that stuff happens within your data management and processing in your GIS and analysis steps. And finally, there's that element of data delivery. I can get into the weeds on this stuff all day long. We have like a workflow chart that is extremely complex of how, like, here's the stage, the movement of data from this to the processing to this needs to be stored here and analyzed, and then you can jettison your intermediary files, and finally the end. You'll learn that stuff as you go on into this kind of field. Next. But instead, I want to just kind of do, I won't say hand wavy, but some really kind of fun, provide you with some fun examples, one of which was for natural resources. Next slide. In particular, 3D modeling of desert areas for desert research. And I cite this one because this was our first largest study. Andy and I went on this together and flew drones over just shy of 3,500 acres in the Mojave Desert, looking at wash delineation. So you can see in this images how you can get down to just really fine scale topographic modeling using the techniques that Andy mentioned before, photogrammetry, where you look at where the modern day applications can see sometimes millions of what's called key points between the images to lock them together that then can render 3D modeling. And with this, we were able to look at stream flows in the area, which also coincide with nature desert tortoise movements. Next slide. So yeah, again, this is the same, this is just an extension of what I was just talking about here. Okay, so in this case, this was one of the 2 plots. So this was 2,300 acres versus the other 1,000 or so acres that flew at another site nearby. The end result, though, which was neat in terms of when it comes to data, loving data, is from these flights, we were able to get a 9 centimeter digital terrain model of that entire area. You can imagine how that's a lot of data. So you get to be big data really fast when you're looking at something like that. So what, 9 centimeters, that's like just over, like under four inches. So highly precise and relatively accurate. I mean, accurate being a little bit different than precision. You can have a little bit of shift in position of pixels where they blur together, but still excellent. Moving on. Another study that was similar to this, conducted in the Tacoma Valley, just south of Death Valley. This area did similar flights and was kind of a challenging project because it was really hot out there that day. But you can see an example of that stream delineation that was conducted. When you do those steps within GIS, using models for stream flow and density to show where stream networks would flow through. And that information is really important for habitat management as well as water management in given areas like this, where that obviously is quite a concern. Moving on. Also conducted some studies within forest environments. In this case, looking at bark beetle kills up in the El Dorado County area near where I grew up. And in this case, what I wanted to highlight was interesting about when you fuse spectral data with elevational data, it makes it possible to be able to identify dead vegetation above ground level. Because you can see with it, looking at the top right image part, where you have this elevation model, and you can see those yellow areas where there's stress within the trees. And for analysis purposes, was able to subtract anything at ground level. So what was actually dead and above ground was then identified within this imagery. And so that can give an estimation, in this case, of bark beetle stress above ground versus debris that had fallen on the ground or was in succession. Hey, next. You can also use various techniques of supervised classification to identify objects on the ground. In this case, this was done completely with spectral classification. It can be also done with object-based analysis that we'll touch on in, I think, one of the very next slide or one of the agricultural slides. But in this case, different spectral characteristics of terrain were able to be used to identify various ground cover types at a post-burn fire or post-fire area up in the Modoc and Lassen County area. Next. Similarly, what this was also useful for is that in a lot of conventional studies, people will use transects and then go out with the painstaking effort of recording details along a line to see how to get robust notes. Well, we found that using a drone overflight, it was much easier to get create transects and record what those values and what those types of vegetation were along that transect in much more efficiently than doing it by hand in the old style conventional way of doing such things. Moving on. Also, multi-spectral data comes into play in natural environments. It's kind of, and Andy touched on this, and if you're not familiar with it, with NDVI or normalized difference vegetation index, it's a relative equation between red and near infrared, and near infrared is important because vegetation that's healthy reflects near infrared much higher than stressed vegetation. And in this case, we used normalized difference vegetation index to assess the recovery of parts of the Hopland Research and Extension Center out in Mendocino County, where we have a research center there, and found that, of course, along stream areas, you have like healthier or quicker recovery from said fires. It's one of our larger projects that we work on right now. Next. Good. Speaking of agriculture, got some case studies here, of course, too. Next. One of the sites that we've flown in quite a number of times and published papers from is the Lynn Cove Research and Extension Center down kind of by Visalia. That's east of Visalia. And next. And at this site, I mentioned before that you can use spectral characteristics to segment or find to delineate different areas of interest. You can use a software such like eCognition for segmentation that is object-based, that you set up a rule system for identifying different shapes and features. And when it comes to data, this is extremely valuable, whether you do it with using those object-based type analyses that also, by the way, can come from LiDAR data or photogrammetry similarly. And then from that, create study blocks, as you see in the right-hand image from the Foundation of Plant Services at UC Davis. Next. And from steps like that, then you have the ability to conduct greater analysis and tying, say, each of those study blocks or plots is enumeration units to calculate the area of leaf area within those plots, the percentage of coverage, normalized difference vegetation index, and other characteristics. So both spectral and structural characteristics. And next. And that doesn't necessarily have to just be with multi-spectral data or RGB data for structure. You can also use thermal data, as in this study here that I conducted at the Kearney Research and Extension Center, not far from Lynn Cove, looking at different treatments and how they relate to the thermal characteristics of the tree through the day, depending on what type of treatment they had been exposed to, whether it's full irrigation or deficit irrigation, grind versus burn. And that's one of the things that I mentioned before, where you sometimes need to have a precise GPS recordings for your imagery for ground control points to match your imagery to samples, because in some cases, not necessarily in this one at all, but you need to have your imagery match up with field measurements. In this case, we knew what plots of trees, but if you're getting more specific, like sprinkler head precision, something like that, then it would matter a lot more. And where I'm going with that is that when it comes to something like tree, when it comes to thermal stress within trees, that is usually related to water in the summertime, or at least heat periods. It also matters what time of the day, is what we found on this study. We later did another study that's not featured here that I should have added for looking at natural environments with thermal imagery throughout the day. And there's certain points in the day when water stress manifests in the tree rather than earlier in the day. Next. Good. And then one of the last ones I think we'll talk about here is orchard structure for genomic research. And one of the most robust studies that we've done is a multi-date, and I think I've flown this one site 8 times and then flown a number of other sites twice that are similar pistachio field or pistachio orchards. And the object of the initial 8 flights on one orchard was to assess the genome, the differences in trees relative to their genetics, and to see if those different trees throughout the season exhibited different characteristics that are associated with fruit production or nut production in this case. And from those studies, we could see on the image to kind of the center, where you see the tree growth through the season. So there's and as everyone knows that like in the winter time, trees drop their leaves, they just are like sticks. And then when they leaf out, they have different areas, including crown size with overleafed area. And we were able to do some analysis of the NDVI and characteristics of those trees. And with that, one of the takeaways that we found working with a researcher at the Foundation for Plant Services at UC Davis was that flying drones to collect such data was incredibly easier than the weeks of time it would spend to do it manually. And then in the end, we felt that the drone imagery was still far more accurate. So there was an efficiency element to that besides the ability to answer or study these approach these scientific questions of the tree health and tying that to the genetic characteristics of those phenotypes of the trees. Next. Good. I think this might be the last slide. And so one of our other research and extension centers, by the way, UCANR has we have 9 research and extension centers spread throughout the state, some related to natural resource management, others to agricultural research. The Desert Research and Extension Center down along the southern border by Oakville is largely dedicated, well, it is an agricultural research center, but of course there's a lot of water studies that go there. And what I use this as an example for is that you don't necessarily need to have a fancy multi-$1,000 drone to fly and get good, valuable data. In this case, this was flown with just a GoPro camera back in the early days of our delving into drone applications. And in the end, I got very good imagery, brought it to the director of the research center, and he was happy to see that there were areas within the imagery that showed where they suspected there were watering issues. And then this was the evidence he needed to say, okay, you need to go out to this plot and fix the pipe irrigation in that area because it's not providing as much as the area next to it. So it was in one of the things that I think is mentioned occasionally throughout our presentations is start easy sometimes, or start little and then work up. You don't need to jump in to buy like a $40,000 drone right off the bat with all the bells and whistles. You can have a more simple drone and collect data that might be just as valuable for what your interest is. Next. Takeaways. So one of the neat things about drones is they allow us to ask new questions, precise questions. And I sometimes say that drones have the evolution of drone technology and also the allowances of regulations now allow us to ask and answer questions that we couldn't have dreamed of just 10 years ago. It's really great. Whether or not they make sense for your project depends on the size, the question, and the data needs. I mentioned before that some at plot scale research scales, this makes sense in a lot of cases. Depends on what questions you're asking. It's great for studying characteristics or differences between different plots. See treatment, say, for example, a treatment of one area versus another area, or maybe an infection of some sort in one area versus another area if we're talking about agricultural areas. And what are your data needs? What do you need to get out of it? Sometimes more data is not necessarily better. Sometimes it's just too much. And even when it comes to resolution, and everyone thinks of spatial resolution of drone imagery, because that's one of its powerful points, is it gets so fine, granular, in a way that you couldn't get out of satellite imagery. But sometimes you don't need that, depending on the scale and the question asked. If you're trying to look at change detection and you're down at a centimeter scale, well, that doesn't make sense because the wind will blow a leaf from 1 centimeter to the next centimeter, and then you'll have false positive of change. So it just all depends about your needs and your questions. There's a lot of moving parts to learn. Start small, we say. These there there's a lot that goes into knowing what to do with drone imagery, and it isn't just about the equipment. It's about knowing the scientific question, knowing the rules and regulations, have good project planning and preparation. The actual flying part is it's entwined with what kind of data that you want to get out of it. If you want to have, again, finer resolution, coarser resolution, whatever, there you need to fly in the right way at the right times of the day, and have all of those elements put together. But then comes the image processing, the stitching that Andy mentioned about connecting all these key points and blending images together into 3D models or orthomosaic images. And finally, the analysis that's done on the GIS end of things, where you take all of that data and then you answer your questions and create deliverables or products that are really interesting to display what the project results are. Sometimes people say like a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's we can get good imagery or pictures or maps out of this sort of stuff that is that definitely explains what we're interested in. Then, of course, regulations and safety is key. You never want to forget that. And just note, this is big data. It gets to be really, really big data. I'm cleaning off my computer all the time right now, especially because I've got a couple terabytes of hard drive space used up, and then that's going to get moved over onto our giant server that's got like dozens of terabytes of data space that's used up. To just kind of account for that. Also processing power. And finally, just know that the flying part is fun, but the data analysis can be just as fun. In fact, occasionally I find it even more fun when it gets creative. But it's an adventurous and fun and useful way to use data. And with that, I think that's just about everything I have. Is there any another slide? I don't think so.
I think that's it. Thank you.